down, take her to the surface. I'm going to Pepper City.
You can't go off and die. We're just a pig, a cat, and a turtle. We need you.
So, I guess so.
The fate of future Master Roshi is one of the biggest mysteries in Dragon Ball history, and some of you are probably thinking that the answer is obvious, that he died when Zeno erased the entire future timeline. But it's not as simple as that, as there are many different versions of Master Roshi in different timelines, and we'll talk about all of that today. The first timeline that we have to start off with is the history of Trunks timeline, which is the timeline that got erased. Now, originally we saw this timeline, and we saw Master Roshi in this timeline because we see that he was hiding in a submarine with Puar, Oolong, and Turtle. And Oolong was talking about trying to get out to go to the house and take a quick break. And all of this basically implies that in this timeline, it's possible that maybe the androids paid Roshi a visit, and to hide and to protect himself, he decided to go underwater. Now, considering the fact that the house was completely intact and the androids didn't decide to completely blow it up, considering that they're very impulsive and dangerous and even more evil in this timeline, that also might imply that the androids never went to Master Roshi's island, and that also means that Master Roshi could still very well never have been paid a visit by the future android. In this case, he could have just been cautious with poor Turtle and Oolong because he knows that if he ever encounters them, he has absolutely no chance. But when we compare this to the manga, basically there was absolutely no mention at all. When Trunks talks about all of the warriors that died against the future androids, he basically mentions everybody besides Roshi. Now, the interesting thing about Master Roshi is that he's technically immortal because he drank the immortal elixir, and when you also factor in that Master Roshi's immortality basically implies that he will never die unless he's basically killed by some other external force, then that basically says that as long as somebody doesn't kill him, he's basically going to be alive. Which means that similar to the end of Dragon Ball GT, when we see 100 years have passed, another popular question about Master Roshi arises there too. After that 100-year time skip, even if you say GT's not canon, did Master Roshi still technically live on his island, considering the fact that he wasn't mentioned, but he probably wouldn't die unless somebody killed him? So it's still very well that Master Roshi could still be alive in GT, and the same case goes for the manga variation, except that he was just never mentioned. Now, if you take a quick look at Dragon Ball Super, before the timeline got erased, we had a very interesting moment where we saw his house briefly, right before Earth blew up, and when we took a look at his house, we saw that Turtle was on top of the roof, all alone outside, would probably mean that Master Roshi was killed in the Dragon Ball Super version of the future timeline because we never saw him, and we just talked about the history of Trunks timeline, where we know the future Trunks that goes Rage Trunks, that went back to the past, that trained with Vegeta in the Room of Spirit of Time, and that went back to his timeline to kill the androids by actually killing them, like in a fight. Whereas the original future Trunks, as I explained in my alternate timeline theory, and just take my word for this because we don't need to go too in-depth about this, basically that original future Trunks found blueprints to kill the future androids, and he was a lot weaker than what the future Trunks that we know was, that killed the androids directly. He killed the androids via a device by observing them and studying them in the unseen timeline, and basically that Trunks wasn't strong enough to kill Cell when Cell hijacked him and killed him for his time machine, so obviously this would make sense because if Trunks wasn't strong enough to directly kill the androids in terms of power and then just gets squashed by Cell, means that this Trunks was obviously a lot weaker, and that was the only way that he managed to kill them. With that said, and the fact that in this original timeline we have an interesting situation where Cell left that timeline, Trunks is dead, so that means if Master Roshi still somehow survived, he would have never have died in this timeline because this timeline never had any threat of Zamasu because Goku was already dead for many years. So that means that if Master Roshi was surviving on his own, he doesn't have to worry about Zamasu, and as long as no other future villain ever shows up, Earth is technically saved by default because the androids are dead and so is Cell. The problem is that if a future threat comes to Earth, then nobody can really defend the planet except for Master Roshi. So if Babidi and Dabura eventually showed up, they literally will have no resistance against them at all. Like, they could literally do whatever the hell they want with the planet, even though there's barely any energy left on the planet to resurrect Boo anyways if they showed up late like they did in Trunks' timeline. Now, we have to also mention the unseen timeline. Now, this is the timeline that we don't know anything about, but this is the timeline that the original Future Trunks went to get the blueprints and go back to the future. Assuming that everything went well in that timeline, then Roshi should be still alive here. Then we also have the stolen timeline. The only thing that you need to know about the stolen timeline is that it's similar to the main timeline, except that in this timeline, this is the one where Zamasu basically took Goku's body. As long as he didn't destroy the planet afterwards, then that basically means that in this timeline specifically, Roshi could still be alive as long as the planet's intact. And there's also one other timeline that we should mention of Master Roshi, and this is also dealing with the new Trunks timeline. I'm just giving it its own name because it technically doesn't have a name. But basically, after the Zamasu arc, Trunks and Mai basically created a new timeline because they went back to a point where they could tell Beerus about Zamasu and all the things that were going to happen, where Trunks would essentially live with the duplicate version of himself. In this timeline, assuming that Zamasu obviously couldn't have done anything, that means Roshi would still be alive if he was alive in all of the other timelines. But this brings up a bigger question about the Mafuba and whether or not it would actually work. Now, if the question is if Master Roshi could use the Mafuba to seal the androids away alone, this seems like a flat-out no. The main reason is because the androids are significantly faster than Roshi. Then you also have to factor in that there are two androids, so if Roshi successfully sealed away one android, the other android could kill him and would still wreak havoc in the future. But you could also say that if Roshi could seal one of the androids away, maybe eventually Trunks and Gohan could keep training with each other over the course of many years, and eventually they could train each other to the point where they could gang up on one android, and maybe they could eventually get an advantage against them after a lot of time has passed, but that would also probably not work because the android would be way more alert as to what Roshi was capable of, and when you consider the fact that the androids, well, specifically Android 17 was implied to have been holding back against future Gohan if you look at the manga, and even in the Japanese version of the anime, they basically implied that they were holding back. That also means that if the androids go all out, if they ever see Gohan and Trunks again, our characters could have some problems. And there's also a third reason why this would fail, and that's the main fact that Master Roshi can't fly. You gotta remember that because Master Roshi basically has to use a spinning turtle to travel throughout the world is relatively slow compared to how incredibly fast the androids actually move. It's kind of similar to playing Pokemon Generation 2 and encountering an Entei, a Raikou, or a Suicune in the wild. You can go into an area where they are, but as soon as you go there, they can already move on to the next area because you took too long to get there, specifically in Master Roshi's case, and because he can't fly, or doesn't bother to fly, that would essentially make it too hard for him to go after the androids, because by the time he gets there, they could be gone, and because the androids don't have an energy that you can sense, you can't really know where they are unless you use the news, and because they wipe out cities so fast, and go on to the next one to destroy it, this just isn't a practical thing to rely on. But there is an alternate way that Master Roshi could save the universe, which you probably saw coming. He could theoretically teach Gohan and Trunks to do it, and over the course of 13 years is more than enough time to learn how to do the Mafuba, considering that future Trunks himself learned how to do the Mafuba after a few minutes of looking at Piccolo doing it on a cell phone. And the fact that Gohan literally has nothing else to do with his life other than try to defeat the androids, Roshi teaching Gohan and Trunks the Mafuba is actually a good idea, considering the fact that there are two of them, so one character can try to seal one android away at a time, and they can do something to try and distract them. The problem here, though, is speed, because if the attack misses and the androids are on guard, then basically Gohan and Trunks only really have one chance to do this, and they both have to do it correct the first time, because if it fails, they're basically going to die. Gohan can maybe, use his abilities to try and get away and escape like he did before, but if he can't get away, then he and Trunks would end up dead. So ultimately, it's safe to say that the Mafuba would work if Roshi decided to teach Gohan and Trunks, but the probability and the margin of error is so small that you could basically say that this would probably fail in all likelihood. And the biggest reason for all of this is because of the fact that there's two androids, and I don't think people really realize how much more difficult it is to seal two androids away, and even having to consider sealing Cell away in the future when he eventually shows up, which would be a shock to everybody, and if Cell is aware of the Mafuba because of the cells that are inside of him, then Cell could use something to counter it, and that would be bad for our characters. So ultimately, it's crazy to think that in a world with so much death, Master Roshi is still probably alive in the majority of these timelines, which really just goes to show that living in isolation can truly have its merits in certain situations.